Good evening. My name is Yvonne Pulaski. I'd like to welcome you to the first District Partnership Advisory Council meeting for the 24-25 school year. It is my privilege to co-chair this group with our superintendent, Mr. Sean McKenna, and I will be handing the meeting over to him right now.
Thank you, Yvonne, so much, and welcome to everybody. We have a number of folks here from Griswold Public Schools, some administrators and participants from our neighboring tuition partner towns. Welcome, and our guest panelists. And I want to especially thank Jessica Gillespie, who's going to, my colleague, administrator at Griswold Public Schools, who's going to help me coordinate the slide presentation this evening. All of the work from this evening will be posted to our site so you can access it. We are very excited to have this conversation and our guest panelists, and I want to thank them ahead of time for taking time out of their busy schedules to meet with us and discuss this important topic. We can go to the next slide, Jess. So we thought we would take an opportunity just to go through some preliminary slides to define the problem and why we're here tonight. And cell phones, social media, and teen mental health make for what we consider an increasingly complex relationship. This relationship has sparked dialogue, questions, many articles. There's one at the end of this presentation that was just published in the New Yorker that I think many of you are going to find interesting. And many people consider this to be an indicator of what we're calling a teen mental health crisis. Now, when we say this, because I did get some emails from parents, there are certainly many positive attributes to technology. We're not saying it is a completely negative thing, but what we are seeing as educators and administrators, that in terms of discipline, in terms of mental health, and in terms of a number of considerations, social media and technology do play a role. So that is the purpose of this discussion. And furthermore, for our friends and families in Griswold, we are not at a point where we're changing our policy or practices. So I don't want people to sound the alarm and think that things are going to radically change here in Griswold, but we need to talk about them. Next slide, please. The Pew Research Center, which is a nonpartisan research center think tank out of Washington, D.C., this time last year, had a number of surveys that they published in various publications and online that addressed the role of technology and social media in the lives of teens and in the lives of how teens interface with their parents, how they interface with each other, and in particular, how they use the cell phone / smartphone. And as you can see, there's some statistics there. 72% of US teens say that they often or sometimes feel peaceful when they don't have their smartphone. 44% say it makes them feel anxious. So as you can see, with just that one data point, there are some different aspects to this conversation. Next slide. The Anxious Generation, which was a book that was published in March of 2024 and a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list and taken up by many individuals and communities. We're proud to have our good friends from Stonington Public Schools to talk about their work with the Anxious Generation. It is a book that has addressed the impact of technology and how that impact has had on the lives of teenagers. The rise in anxiety, it highlights a significant increase in anxiety and depression among teens, linking these trends to the pervasive use of digital technology. Next slide. Go back one. The book also takes up the social dynamics of teens and the use of smartphones and social media. Being a parent myself, I can tell you that we work very closely with our children so as to have a healthy interaction with social media rather than an unhealthy one. And the cultural shifts. The author, Dr. Haidt, discusses the broader cultural changes that coincide with the digital revolution, including shifts in parenting and education that contribute to heightened anxiety. Next slide, please. This is from the Pew Research Center, and again, this is from November 2023. You can see that despite concerns about social media's impact, many teens continue to use these platforms frequently, whether it's YouTube, TikTok, Snapchat, or Instagram. This chart comes from Dr. Haidt's research, and he contends, and that's the author of The Anxious Generation, that the rise in teen mental health issues is closely linked to the increased smartphone usage since 2010. That is a time period that he spends a great deal on in his book, looking at the shifts in behaviors, the shifts in student mental health issues, whether it's in the school or in hospitals. Next. Haidt also highlights that since 2010, older teens and college-aged adults have experienced a disproportionate surge in anxiety diagnoses compared to other age groups. So I've done plenty of talking. At this point in time, we are very honored and privileged to welcome our guest panel. We have here tonight Dr. Ravid Stein, Attorney Daniel Murphy, Superintendent of Public Schools in Stonington, Marion Butler, and Principal of Stonington Middle School, Jeff Parkinson. We are going to start with Dr. Ravid Stein, who is a psychologist at EastCon. She is also an adjunct professor at UConn and has done a number of work projects in different districts throughout the state of Connecticut, working with administrators and faculty and staff on psychological consultation. So if we can go to the next slide, Jessica, I'm going to welcome Ravid, and thank you for joining us, and happy anniversary to you and your husband. The first topic, Ravid, I'm going to ask you is, how has social media changed the landscape for teen mental health?
Thanks so much, Sean. Thanks so much for having me in. Hello and welcome to those of you joining us on this busy evening. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think that's a real big question, and I know that you had a chance to kind of show the sobering statistics. So I think that the interesting piece of this is just in terms of thinking about all the parents out in the audience and how it feels to be the parent of teenagers and considering that mental health piece. What does it look like to set boundaries around cell phone use, how to have it be a conversation and not just a black and white issue, because we understand that phones are just such a part of our lives, but recognizing the signs of how technology and social media can impact that mental health. So I think beyond the statistics, and again, those sobering statistics, I think the interesting piece is to just consider, what can conversations between families look like around cell phone use, and how it makes children, how it makes your children or students that you work with, if we have educators on the call, feel. So you saw in the earlier slide that some students, some children, some adolescents feel more anxious when they don't have their phones, and others feel more relaxed when they don't have their phones. So I think the first piece of this conversation is just to have a conversation about it, just to start the discussion around, what does it feel like to be away from your phone? What does it feel like to put do not disturb on? What can it feel like to step away from the social media? What does it bring up for you? And beginning to navigate some of the emotions that go along with it, instead of considering it something that's all good or all bad. Because we know that when we consider the habits that all of us have as adults with relation to technology, we can understand that some are habits that we can appreciate, like the idea that a GPS can always tell us where we are and where we need to go. And others can be difficult for us, like not being able to stop scrolling when we're looking for something and we automatically click that Instagram or Facebook button and then find ourselves there longer than we would have liked. So I really encourage those of you on the call, Sean, I'm not sure if we're going to have kind of back and forth or opportunities for people to write into the chat, but questions that people may have about what does it look like to have those tricky conversations with adolescents about how social media is impacting their mental health.
So Ravit, that's a good question before we get to your next topic. I just put into the chat, we are going to wait for all of the panelists to present, and then we're going to have a question and answer period. We do want to hear from everybody, but we are going to wait for each panelist to present. And at the end of the panelist session, we will take questions and we will have answers. So Ravit, the next topic is, from your perspective, and I know you were instrumental in the book club that we had in the spring, how has parenting been impacted by the age of the smartphone and social media?
I think that's a multifaceted question, and I think it's best answered by seeing it in a twofold manner, really thinking about how I am a parent of 3 children, ages 8, 14, and 15. So it's busy. And I think there's pieces of this that relate to what does parenting look like for children who already have access to telephones, to social media, to smartphones, and what does it look like for our children who don't yet have access? How do we make decisions about what kind of boundaries we would be setting? And again, as I had said earlier, when I was thinking about your previous question, having conversations and being proactive about what those boundaries will look like is one of the most important things that I think parents and educators can do in terms of considering social media use. A person that works very closely with Dr. John Haidt and in recent weeks has been really partnering with him to talk about the parenting aspect is Dr. Becky Kennedy. So she runs a platform and does podcasts, and people may have heard of her. She has a framework called Good Inside, but really talks about what does parenting look like in the age of social media. And she recently developed some conversation starters around what can contracts look like for families, what are some ways that families can consider social media usage in the home, and organizing it around it being a collaborative decision with children. And then how to navigate, what does it look like for us as parents to model that behavior? So if one of the things that Dr. Becky Kennedy talks a lot about is no cell phones in the room at night. So how does it look to ask children to not have phones overnight in their own bedrooms? And if we're going to ask them to do that, are we modeling that as adults? Are we also keeping our phones out of our bedrooms at night? So considering the two pieces of the conversation, what can conversations and contracts and collaborative discussions about social media use for teens with parents, and then what can parents do to model those behaviors if we're asking our children to navigate that tricky relationship with our technology?
Thank you, Ravi. And that podcast that Becky Kennedy has, it's called Good Inside. Is that correct?
I can put a link into the chat related
awesome.
to a conversation that she recently had with Dr. Haidt, that you can find online, as well as her website.
Thank you so much. And again, if you have a question for Ravi, what I would ask that you do is you can type it right now into the chat, but we will get to all the questions and the answers after all the panelists have presented. I will ask the panelists on your behalf to keep things moving. The question that you have asked, feel free to put it in the chat and we can get things moving right after the panelists have presented. So we are going to move on to our next panelist, Attorney Dan Murphy. He practices all aspects of labor, employment, education, and business-related immigration law. And I know that the 3 superintendents, including myself on this call this evening or Zoom, have worked with Dan on various aspects of the work that we do. He is also admitted to the bar in Connecticut, the United States District Court for the District of Connecticut, United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, United States District Court for the District of New Jersey, and the United States Court for Appeals for the Third Circuit. And Dan, welcome. I guess the first question we have is, does a student child have a constitutional right to possess and use a smartphone/cell phone during school hours?
So unlike, I think, a lot of the other topics that we're going to be talking about, where there's kind of like a lot of different approaches and a lot of different answers, I got the easy question here. A lot of times when we talk about constitutional issues, we think of these complex arguments, and we're looking at the Constitution, and we're looking at these lengthy history of case law, et cetera, to get an answer. And we really have a very straightforward answer in the schools when it comes to the rights to use cell phones. The bottom line is students do not have constitutional right to use cell phones in school. And also, very importantly, there's not a constitutional right to have parent-student contact via cell phone. I've dealt with a lot of districts where there'll be a parent like very forcefully demanding that their child is to have a cell phone at all times. They are to have access to the child at all times through the cell phone. And the courts have universally found that where cell phone bans or limitations are reasonably related to legitimate pedagogical concerns, the policies are generally found to be constitutional. And when we talk about pedagogical concerns, those are really broad concepts. You just have to tie it to something regarding attentiveness in school, enforcement of school rules, safety, limitation of theft in the schools, or something along those lines. It's very easy for school districts to develop constitutionally sound policies that either limit or preclude cell phone use in its entirety.
Thank you, Dan. And what legal authority do boards of education have and or administration to restrict the use of cell phones and smartphones?
So there's some very specific laws, and then there's some broader provisions as well in the law that grant boards of education significant authority in making determinations as to whether they're going to limit and how much they're going to limit cell phones. The first statute that we have is Connecticut General Statutes 10-233J, it's subsection B, and I'll read that to you. It's very short. It says a local or regional board of education may restrict the student possession or use of cellular mobile telephones in the schools under its jurisdiction. In determining whether to restrict such possession or use, the local or regional board of education shall consider the special needs of parents and students. Now, I think a lot of parents may look at that language and say, they have to look at our very specific situation. And the statute doesn't require super specific, individualized review of whether a policy is appropriate or not. That is a very, very broad consideration, and it's interesting that the legislatures used the word consider. They were very, very specific in that all we have to do is take those needs into consideration. And, I think of, when we think of a parent saying, I need to have that immediate access to my child via cell phone, somehow those of us who are older in the room, we all survived growing up where, a call could come through the central office and we'd still be able to get that information from mom and dad in a relatively quick period of time. There's another statute, Connecticut General Statutes 10-220A, and that grants local school boards broad control over the schools in their jurisdiction, and they have final control over operation of school buildings, grounds, and facilities. So that's a generalized statutory provision under which the board would have some authority to limit, again, or prohibit cell phone access. One other thing, Sean, I don't think we were definitely going to have a question on this one, but there's a much broader issue to deal with, and that's cell phone searches. And to summarize the law on that one, it's a big maybe. People love hearing that. Oh, great, the lawyer tells us maybe. The bottom line for cell phone searches in schools is it's all going to depend, and this is where there is a very large body of constitutional law. It's the right is based on a pivotal U.S. Supreme Court case called TLO versus New Jersey. And the big takeaway from that case is that a search of a student's phone or a student's belongings, like a backpack or a cell phone, has to be two things. Number one, that search has to be justified from its inception. In other words, we have to have a justifiable reason for conducting the search. And two, the scope of the search has to be reasonably related to the circumstances that justified the search in the first place. So putting that in simple terms that we can all understand, if a school administrator is looking for a bazooka, right? Yeah. We're not going to look in a child's pocket for the bazooka. Where are we going to look? If the child has a hockey bag that he's walking around with, a big gear bag, right? That's going to be reasonable. If we put it in the context of cell phones, the search of a cell phone can be reasonable in a circumstance where, let's say, student 1 says that student 2 was sending him harassing texts and also alleges that he was sending them to 2 other students. The district could, under those circumstances, likely search that other student's phone for evidence that they were sending inappropriate text. Now, can they search the whole phone? Probably not, right? We're talking about text messages. So looking for text messages between students 1 and student 2 under those circumstances would be a reasonable search. So that's search and seizure law for school districts in hopefully a minute or less.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And again, there's a number of people on this Zoom this evening. If you have questions, we are going to ask our panelists after they're all done presenting. Feel free to start typing your questions in the chat so that we can make the best use of our time. So our next presenter is our good friend, Marianne Butler from Stonington Public Schools. Marianne has been the superintendent there since 2022. Prior to that, she was the assistant superintendent. And I want to give Marianne all the credit in the world. She spearheaded a regional superintendent book club last spring on the anxious generation and has done a lot of community outreach. And Marianne, how have you enlisted community partners to broaden the interest in the use of smartphones and how this has impacted adolescents?
Well, first of all, again, thanks, Sean, for putting this group together, because I do think there's power in numbers here. And I think the more districts can be on the same page and share their experiences around these conversations, it's just going to elevate the whole topic that's so important to all of our communities. We had the good fortune last year to have a funding source to supply some Yonder pouches for the middle school this year. And that conversation with the Board of Education happened last spring about, is this an appropriate intervention for our particular school? We had an uptick in bad behavior over social media that spilled over into the school, involved out of school events, in school events, and just even there was a noticeable flurry of activity in my office around possible expulsions that all had a social media component to it. So the board really got behind this idea about let's get to the kids at that age when they're kind of trying to find themselves, when their frontal lobe isn't quite developed yet, and supported in April by vote the implementation of Yonder pouches for the Stonington Middle School. And at the same time, by luck, Jonathan Haidt's book came out, Anxious Generation, and parents started reading it, students started reading it. I gave it to my leadership team. I gave it to the area superintendents and said, read this. And the conversation just kind of organically started that, wow, look at the body of data behind this. And one of those conversations was our first select woman who said, I have some money through Human Services that could actually put a public health announcement up on the billboard on Route 1 about the Wait Till 8 message and pledge. And that started it. And the parents got behind it. They started to organize themselves. We got the Chambers of Commerce involved. They planned some events and will continue to plan some events. And before I knew it, I was in conversation with Mark Gausseau, over the superintendent in Westerly, and his board chair on how we could partner together. So he and I actually gave parallel convocation speeches this year about the anxious generation and what we can do in our districts, as well as our communities, to support the improvement of the state of mental health for our students.
And that's wonderful. Since you've had these developments since last spring, where do you see this going into the rest of the school year in the future?
So last week, Ravit was with me for a similar panel discussion. It was in person, but it was sponsored by our Chambers of Commerce, and it actually featured several very high-profile business people in the community. And the topic was how smartphones and social media affects their businesses, not only from the front of the counter, the outward-facing piece, but also inward as far as the kind of onboarding they have to do with their young personnel now because of their inability to interact in real time, their constant addiction to being on the phone, their lack of interpersonal skills, their lack of being able to manage their time. And it was a really fascinating conversation. And I think that's why this is taking such root, is that there isn't a community person, no matter age, business, vocation, whatever, that isn't touched by this topic. It's also led to several conversations with other adults, whether they're colleagues or parents, about what am I going to do? As Ravit would say, what tiny habit am I going to invoke in my life to model for the children, whether it's going on a walk in the morning without my phone, or we're going to make sure that our phones when we're in a business meeting are put away. We forget sometimes as adults, the secretaries are going to get the call if anybody really needs us. So I see those continued conversations. I had a very high profile businesswoman have coffee with me the other day. She's very interested in doing some activities with the businesses around the holidays to again promote parents and families doing these offline, off-screen activities and coming into businesses either for, a free cookie or a free coffee or something like that. I think that will continue. And today we actually were approached by an Institute of Higher Education asking if we might be interested in being a partner in applying for a grant to develop some curriculum around this idea of what does it really look like as being a good digital citizen and being an ethical person and a nice person within the content areas rather than as an advisory program. So I don't think there's an end in sight. I really want to keep the heat on to keep this in the forefront of everybody's mind. I know that the library, Stonington Free Library, already has another event planned for March. And I think that's my mission anyways, is to keep this out there and at the forefront so people understand this is not a one and done and we cannot do it alone. We have to have community members and families be partners in this, addressing this epidemic.
Wonderful. And to take the work of Stonington to the next level, we are going to welcome our good friend, Mr. Jeff Parkinson, who is the principal of Stonington Middle School. And Jeff, welcome. We are interested in to hear from you about the implementation of the new cell phone policy at your school.
Thank you very much, Sean. Happy to be back. See a lot of familiar faces. So good to see everybody. So I think what we started with this year, our policy, I think if you were to open our handbook and read our policy, I don't think it's dramatically different than most middle schools you're going to go to in the area in terms of kind of our expectations of the students and the kind of different tiered consequences or plans or protocols if the students are caught using cell phones. I think that's all pretty standard. I think a couple of things we just like to make sure we do. We are definitely doing it with as much fidelity as possible. We are very clear. We are very black and white in terms of the expectations to the students and the parents. And we are making sure we're enforcing those and following up with those as well. The one piece that is different with our policy than most schools is the existence of the Yonder pouches. So our students all were issued on the first day of school a Yonder pouch, which is a pouch that locks the phone in and can only be unlocked with a magnet. It's kind of a similar technology to the items that are on your clothing that they unlock when you check out at a store. It's that kind of technology. But anyway, they were all issued one. The expectation is that they will lock the phone up on the way into the building, or even in their parents' car on the way in or something along those lines. And then it will be away in their bag or their locker all day in the pouch, locked up. That's the expectation. So far, that's gone well in terms of the entry to the school. It hasn't slowed up the entry or any way. It's also gone very well at the exit. I think that's probably a question a lot of people have in the back of their mind, if that's slowed up our dismissal or anything like that. It has gone very well for us. We have two separate exits. We stagger our dismissals a little bit in terms of bus waves, so that helps, but really has not slowed us up at all in terms of the unlocking of the pouches. We have had to do some, compliance checks. We did one, I think, 2 weeks into school, just because, again, these are middle school kids, so they're going to see if we're serious about a rule. So we did, get a few kids who were generally had them in their lockers and had them put away, but they were resisting to lock it up. And I did on that day see a lot of kids who were really struggling to lock the pouch, even being instructed to right in front of me. It was very hard for them to let go and truly lock that device up, but they did. We will revisit that and do that over the course of the year, just to, again, make sure we're maintaining fidelity with the policy and with the pouches. But so far, so good with it. We really have had no issues with cell phones. We've had very, very few cell phone violations, other than that one compliance check where we got some students. The students and parents, for that matter, have been generally very, very supportive of the policy and understanding that this is, whether they agree or disagree with kind of the level to which we're going to I think take these out of our school. They do all see the value in what we're doing, and that they think this is the way to go. And that we do need to have our kids be separated from these devices when it's time to learn.
And so you've kind of addressed the next topic, but just out of curiosity, are there any specific challenges? Are there any sort of bright lights that have gone off with the implementation that everybody seems to be supportive of?
A couple. I think the challenge I think we're going to face is just consistently being able to check for compliance, because with any policy or rule, I think you have to do that to make sure everyone understands it's being serious. So the balance of that with the, not taking too much time out of the education and the instructional time to be able to do that. I think that if you're doing too much of that, then you're going to eventually get parent pushback probably. So you have to find that balance of how often to do it and how regularly to do it, and clear and consistent communication to the students and to their caregivers about the expectations that you will do this too, so that there's no complaints that, these are gotchas and you're trying to get kids. You want to make sure that's clear. And then some of the rewards we've seen, I think, go hand in hand with just our kind of our doubling down with the taking away the technology, but then also doubling down on the free unstructured playtime. I did steal a page out of Griswold's book and bring recess to Stonington Middle School. I brought it with me. Shout out to Lewis. And so it's been really, really great for the kids, because to watch them actually, because our 7th and 8th graders, for example, some of them had been a year or two since they'd had recess. So they'd gotten out of their routine with it. So to watch them out there and just really kind of roll some recess equipment out and just see what they do, and watch them develop their own systems and their own structures and their way to play, which is another huge part of the Anxious Generation book, has been awesome. And it has really, I think, positively impact the students' focus and engagement in the second half of the day. We've noticed, we actually, interestingly enough, this week, the weather has cooperated. We had our first indoor recess of the entire year. The weather's been that good. And we had a noticeable difference in the cafeteria after, in the students' kind of their demeanor, their volume levels, their ability to sit still without the outdoor recess. So it definitely is impacting. So that, coupled with, I think, the cell phones, has been a really great reward to see the students. And it is, I think they are slowly realizing that this is better for them. Only time will tell, but I think they are.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists. And once again, if you are participating in this, we have a few more slides to get through. We would ask that if you have questions for a specific panelist, please type in the question in the chat. I will ask the question once we have completed the next few slides. Again, if you have a question, we want to hear from you. Please type the question in the chat. I will ask the panelists the question, and we will go from there. So we did include in the slide deck, which we will make available on our website, some recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics. We even included a link at the end on our resources page. So there are recommendations for parents with respect to social media and how to implement some best practices. And if we go to the next one, I think there's some recommendations from schools from the American Academy of Pediatrics. And that volume 132, issue 5 is hyperlinked on our resources page. Next slide. We have included all the resources that we cited this evening: the American Academy of Pediatrics, Children and Adolescents in the Media, Jonathan Haidt, Dr. Haidt, the Anxious Generation, he has a digital resource page where you can access free resources, data, and many different documents. Doom scrolling, this is an interesting article that was published in the print edition of the New Yorker. The online edition has a different title, Has Social Media Fueled a Teen Suicide Crisis by Andrew Solomon. I would encourage you to take a listen to that or read it. I think there's 2 options on the website if you choose to check that out. And Teen Social Media and Technology, the 2023 study that we referenced from the Pew Research Center. It has a series of different surveys, different results, and you can see from perusing that data set that there's some fascinating work to be done in this area, and definitely topics to explore for schools, for parents, and for educators and community members. So that brings us to our Q&A session, and I don't see any questions in the chat. I have one question for Dan. In the instance of where schools ask students to put the cell phone in the yonder pouch, or if you have a situation where you have the teacher at the beginning of class say, okay, I have a storage area in my room. It might be one of those storage areas where we store calculators, something of that sort, and you put the smartphone in that area. And let's just say that the student is claiming, regardless if it happened or not, that there's damage that occurred during this either storing or retrieving. To what extent is the school responsible for the smartphone if there is this allegation of damage that happened while storing the cell phone in this classroom or in the pouch?
Is there potential liability? Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
Certainly there's going to be proof issues. I mean, we're at a point in time where cell phones aren't cheap, right?
Right.
It's not uncommon to everybody to be walking around with $700, $800, $900 phones, and we don't even think of that value, right? Like, I don't know anybody who's gone out and just bought a phone for $1,000. It's all buried in your cell phone plan, and we don't really think of those costs. Honestly, Sean, I've never even thought of that possible issue, but it's a significant one, right? Is the potential there for somebody to make an allegation that, due to the negligence of the staff member, there was damage to the property of the child? Sure. I think there's going to be significant proof problems there. Certainly you'd have to show that the property wasn't damaged previously. I think there's going to be very difficult proof issues associated with it. Is it possible? Sure. I haven't heard one instance of it. Now, that may be largely because they're dealt with at the local level to the extent those issues come up, and they just never wind up involving me as a lawyer. As a lawyer, I can envision the issues associated with it. I'm curious to hear from, you or the other administrators on the panel. Have you guys come up with this issue at all? I mean, I'm sure you have in one form or another. Somebody's always saying something's broken and somebody caused it.
I don't know if one of my colleagues want to take that question. I don't recall of a specific instance in recent memory where we've had that issue in Griswold. But now that people are moving to either a yonder pouch or we have it here in Griswold where we ask the students to store the device in a classroom. And I think more districts are doing that. I'm just wondering if that's going to be an issue where someone claims there was damage.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that that's something that the local district has to be thinking about as you develop your policy. Is it
Right.
better for all the yonder pouches to be held in a box at the front of the room? Or is it better that, you have the kids walking around holding their own yonder pouches? I thought Jeff's comments before were interesting that, you got to do a compliance check, and
Right.
you certainly find kids who are going to find or try and find ways around it. And, I think there's positives and negatives to both. And I think you just got to take a look at what's going to work best for the district. I can certainly, see that the district holding on to all of the phones in a box in a room is certainly going to increase the chances that somebody's going to say somebody else broke my phone, right? Versus if I'm holding the phone in my own yonder pouch, or I got to keep it in my locker locked up. I don't think there's any one perfect solution to any of this. I think any avenue you go down is going to have its positives and negatives.
So Dan, while you're on, we have a question from the chat from Jackie. Is the liability the same as if kids were putting the phones in their locker?
Well, I think that the risk for the district is lower if the phones are being kept in the locker, right? Because I envision that as the child is putting the phone in the locker, him or herself, and closing the locker, and nobody else presumably has access to the locker. So I think the liability, or let me say it this way, the risk is much lower if you're using the lockers versus the box in a room. I also think the issue with the box in the room, it increases the chances for liability, because if it's, on one end of the spectrum, if it's just an open box sitting there, you increase the chances for theft as well, right?
So Sean, it's kind of interesting in that certainly in my mind, not only putting those phones, whether they're in the yonder pouches or not, into these places, right? Especially if they were in a yonder pouch, it's another distraction, it's another transition, it's another unnecessary concentration on that phone, which is, I think, why it was smart for Jeff to decide they're going to go in the pouches and they're going to go in the locker. And really, we did a little bit of homework on this with other people in the company who have been doing this for a lot longer than we have. Right. We have had conversations, though, and Jeff had some early experiences with the pouches getting damaged from the little guys who thought that they were going to be Superman and unlock them and that kind of thing. So it goes both ways on the damage.
So, Marianne, since you're on, there's another question in the chat. This one is from Jennifer. Are there thought groups, think groups of educators, administrators who are working in a structured conversation to share how to manage the effects of removing the phones or sharing best practices? I know this topic has come up in the different groups that we're a part of, but do you know of any other groups?
I know of, our regional group that has had mostly informal conversations. I don't know of anybody who has had formal conversations, although certainly it oozed up to the State Department of Education since they came out with their position statement conveniently right before school opened. Right. So that, I think that is evidence, it's anecdotal evidence, but it's evidence that they were hearing from districts that we're not waiting for Hartford. We're going to take the bull by the horns and do this, because anything like policy-wise coming out of Hartford is going to be a long time coming. So I think, again, that's a signal, right? A signal of what is happening in a very organic way around the state and around the country.
Right, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Marianne, isn't Manchester Public Schools doing something similar?
I believe they were one of the first, Manchester, one of the middle schools in Manchester was really one of the first schools that we contacted to figure out, what went well, what did they have hiccups with. And they had only been at it 6 months prior to the board, voting on it. They implemented the pouches in semester break, I believe, last year. And that's a lot of attention came to that school because the governor, when he made his announcement that he wanted to kind of move in this direction, that's where he did his press conference from. But they did exactly what Jeff did. They had a no nonsense approach. We are not playing about this. We are not entertaining any, exceptions because, my child's special or whatever the case may be. And really, I got one phone call so far this year, and it was about somebody who just needed to learn the correct interpretation of the Fourth Amendment and, had some misunderstandings about the law and how the board operated and how they voted. And then that is actually governing what we're doing in our schools. So a lot of it's education. And that's why we did a kickoff panel last spring with, Ravit and Dan and a lot of the other folks in our community to educate people about why are we doing this? We're not just doing it out of the blue. There's a lot of research behind it. And we believe it's in the best interest of our students in their mental health and also providing conditions for them to access the curriculum.
Thanks,
Well,
Mary
just to
Ann.
dovetail on that,
Sure.
I think it's really interesting from my perspective because I look at this from a very specific area, right? I'm typically dealing with disciplinary issues, sexual harassment, texting going back and forth,
Oh,
photographs or videos of fights in buildings, et cetera. That's typically where this stuff comes up. I found it really fascinating, this being the second panel I've sat on, the first one being over in Stonington, where when you bring together a bunch of people with different perspectives on this problem, I have learned so much more. And it's really been a tremendous help to me as a lawyer when I could hear what school administrators are going through, what parents are going through, what the police are going through, and, et cetera. It's super, super helpful. And I think there's so much for everybody to learn on this. And the more you can encourage families to come out and hear these presentations, particularly from a diverse group of presenters, the better off the community is going to be in the long run.
Dan, I don't know if you and Mary Ann want to sort of co-tag this one. Someone just direct messaged me, an administrator. If you have operative language in your handbook regarding the potential for damaged phones, does that help, air quotes, the school and or district in the event that a cell phone gets damaged in the storage process?
I don't know that the statement in and of itself is really going to help.
Right.
I think in the end, it's going to largely focus on the policies that the district utilizes for maintenance and monitoring of the phones. A, what the policies are, and then B, whether they're implemented. Certainly, notifying families that bringing devices, to school, whether they are handled by the district or not, brings with it inherent risks. When you put 300 kids in a building
Right.
and they have expensive toys with them, you do run the risk. But I don't know that the statement in the handbook in and of itself is going to protect the district from liability.
Thank you. Another question we have, I think this is for Mary Ann or maybe Jeff. Are smart watches also locked in pouches?
Yeah, we have it's three-pronged: phone, earbuds, and smartwatches. All three. So believe it or not, actually, all three unless they have a gigantic case on their phone, all three can fit in a yonder pouch at the same time. Actually,
fascinating.
And we'll graciously get them another pouch if they need it for all their devices.
I have extras.
You have extras.
And actually, interestingly enough, this could be a question on people's minds too. Like, you do have those very, very rare cases. For example, the students with some sort of health, a diabetic who needs their phone to access it or things like that. And obviously, the option for them to not have a pouch at all. But actually, Yonder did provide us with about 10. They're just a Velcro closed pouch. So, the kid is still holding to the policy there in the pouch, but they can access it. It's just simply Velcro to open. So, we did offer that up to one specific student who's a student who they almost felt more included having a pouch like everyone else, even though obviously most kids would view it as a negative, and they can get to their pouch when they need to, but it's Velcroed up and it's in their locker like it's supposed to.
Thanks so much. So that brings us to the end of our questions.